Hello, class. I hope everyone is surviving the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a little different than I think we hoped our presentations would go, but I guess we'll give it a shot. So, my presentation is on LGBT youth and conversion therapy. What is conversion therapy? So, conversion therapy is the set of practices intended to alter a person's sexual orientation and or gender identity. Conversion therapy is also known by other terms which you may have heard, such as reparative therapy, sexual orientation change efforts, also abbreviated as SOCE, and ex-gay therapy. Now, who is affected by conversion therapy? Well, as you may have guessed, persons who identify as LGBTQ plus are affected, and persons who exhibit characteristics of the LGBT members or of that community. Conversion therapy is often used on minors who identify or exhibit LGBTQ plus characteristics. So the affected persons, here are some numerical statistics about them. The Williams Institute of the UCLA School of Law has a really good study on this, and they estimate that over 698,000 LGBT adults ages 15 through 59 have received conversion therapy in the U.S. This includes nearly 350,000 LGBT adults who received conversion therapy as adolescents, so when they were minors. That number again is 350,000 LGBT adults who received conversion therapy as a minor. Now, as of January 2018, the numbers read as this. There are 20,000 LGBT youth ages 13 through 17. That's the category in which they're quantifying as youth, is that 13 through 17 age range. And these over 20,000 of these people will receive conversion therapy from a licensed healthcare professional. And over 57,000 youth, once again, ages 13 through 17, will receive conversion therapy from a religious or spiritual advisor. And we'll see later how those two things kind of overlap in the practice of conversion therapy and kind of where it stems from regarding the social implications and the religious implications and how all that is intertwined. So we've talked about kind of the numbers and who is affected, but what goes on during conversion therapy? So what types of practices are generally used? So in present times, physical treatments are still used, but very rarely, and the primary forms of treatment include behavioral, cognitive, and psychoanalytic conversion therapies. According to a study by the American Psychological Association, known as the APA when abbreviated, the study was conducted in 2009, and conversion therapy tactics that professionals have used are some of these that I will list now, but they are not limited to just these. So inducing nausea, vomiting, or paralysis while the patient is shown homoerotic imagery, receiving electric shocks, invoking physical pain such as snapping an elastic band on body parts while being aroused by homoerotic imagery, shaming to create an aversion to homosexual attraction, reconditioning of orgasmic activity from that of same-sex attraction to heteronormative attraction. There's also hypnosis and talk therapy. Talk therapy being the most common use of conversion therapy, and as you can imagine, it's more of the behavioral and cognitive aspect of it, and it's what you would assume of the talking back and forth, akin to more normalized practices of therapy. The current guidelines for conversion therapy practices are promulgated by a group called the National Association for Research and Therapy of Homosexuality, also known as NARTH when abbreviated. And this group is a group that advocates and endorses and encourages even the use of conversion therapy practices, and they saw set forth to use some guidelines, I guess, to if you're going to practice conversion therapy, to kind of have these guidelines. So now let's talk about the impacts of conversion therapy. So conversion therapy often leads to high levels of depression, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts and behavior. The San Francisco State University conducted a study which found that LGBT youth who are rejected from their parents or family, and thus coinciding with the implementation of conversion therapy practices, are 8 times more likely to attempt suicide. They are 5.9 times more likely to exhibit high levels of depression, 3.4 times more likely to use illegal drugs, and once again, 3.4 times more likely to contract HIV or AIDS. So conversion therapy has been in practice in the U.S. for about, give or take, a century. And so now let's look at the history of conversion therapy in the United States, kind of where it began and how it's evolved throughout the years and how it's gotten to the point where we are at today, and looking at this effect on minors throughout the entirety of its use as well. So, a history of conversion therapy in the United States. The earliest documented instance of conversion therapy in the United States was in the 1890s, so a little over a century ago. The use of conversion therapy was approved by most practicing psychiatric physicians and establishments through the 1930s through the 1960s. Even in 1962, the famous psychiatrist Irving Beaver published a study known as Homosexuality, a Psychoanalytic Study of Homosexual Males. In this study, Irving Beaver stated that it was likely that all homosexuals could convert to heterosexuality if they were strongly motivated to change. So this continued, as I said, from the 1930s really until the 1960s. And then in the 1960s, we know there's a lot of movements that go on and a lot of sexual freedom that begins to take place, and a shift in our understanding towards a lot of things, and sexuality being one of those. So after the Stonewall riot in 1969, which is a famous gay rights moment, I guess you would say, and a really strong push towards the movement of gay rights. So this occurred in 1969. So after this Stonewall riot, strong activism regarding homosexuality caused much change in the opinion of homosexuality, and then thus conversion therapy. As a result of this activism, the American Psychiatric Association, also known as the APA, voted to remove homosexuality as a mental disorder from the DSM-2, which is their diagnostic manual, in 1973. So 4 years after the Stonewall riot, they made that change, removing it from their, medical standards as a mental disorder. In 2001, a little more recently, the Surgeon General David Satcher issued a formal report stating that there is no valid scientific evidence that sexuality can be changed. So, what were the practices that were historically used in this conversion therapy throughout the U.S.? So some of these were aversive conditioning techniques, which include electric shock, once again, the nausea-inducing drugs when homosexual stimuli are presented. There was also sex therapy, and I believe one of the most horrific practices used was lobotomies. So, in the decades of the 1940s and 1950s, Walter Freeman used the ice pick lobotomy for treating homosexuality. He performed over 3,000 lobotomies during this time in over 23 states, so his range was pretty broad there. He had absolutely no surgical training whatsoever, which is extremely alarming if you're going to be operating on people's brains. And up to 40% of his patients were gay and were undergoing these lobotomy treatments as a form of correction of this homosexuality. Another very horrifying technique and practice of conversion therapy used was castration among men. So, the American Psychiatric Association, the APA's historical response, once again, in 1973, the APA removed homosexuality from being listed as a mental disorder in the DSM-2. In 1987, the APA removed ego-dystonic homosexuality from the DSM-3R and outright opposed homosexuality as being any type of disorder. So they make a claim in the 80s saying, we're removing all inclination that any type of homosexual, ego disorder or any type of homosexuality is considered a disease or disorder of any type. In 2004, the APA spoke against NARTH, which we mentioned before, is the group that encourages conversion therapy and gives guidelines for its practice. So in 2004, the APA spoke against NARTH, stating that their activities are demeaning against LGBT persons. The APA created a task force to review its own policies concerning reparative therapy, another name for conversion therapy. And in 2009, the APA solidified its stance on the abolition of the use of conversion therapy and stated that it encourages mental health professionals from misrepresenting the efficacy of sexual orientation change efforts. So in 2009, the APA once again made a broad statement that blatantly denies that sexual orientation change efforts, SOCE, conversion therapy, reparative therapy, all of these names mean the same thing, that these efforts are not efficient in mental health professionals using these, especially on minors, to change sexuality. So we talked a little before about the overlap between social issues and conversion therapy. So the social issues relating to conversion therapy, religion and conversion therapy intersect in what is known as ex-gay ministry. Ex-gay ministry consists of attempting to convert LGBT persons, often minors, to heterosexuality. Some of these ministries claim that they do not practice any clinical measures to achieve conversion to heterosexuality, but that is often not the case for all. Exodus International, which is one of the largest proponents of ex-gay ministry, stopped practicing its conversion therapy tactics in 2013 and issued an apology for the harm they have caused through their previous ministerial efforts, which I think was a welcome apology among the LGBT community through the use of these ex-gay ministries and that overlapping there. And you can kind of track the change in which society has kind of understood the science behind conversion therapy or the lack thereof. So now I want to get into the legal issues invoked in the use of conversion therapy, specifically on conversion therapy and its use on minors. So, in 2012, California passed Senate Bill 1172, which prohibits licensed therapists in the state from attempting to change a minor's sexual orientation or gender identity. The passage of this law made California the first state to protect LGBT youth from conversion therapy. In 2013, the state of New Jersey enacted a similar bill, becoming the second state to do so and starting a nationwide trend in this type of legislation. These laws protect against SOCE practice on minors, which include any practice that attempts to change sexuality, behaviors, or the reduction of romantic feelings towards members of the same sex. These laws do not prohibit safe therapeutic practice that provide understanding of coping with sexual identity, exploration of sexual identity, and other safe practices that would aid a minor in coping with their sexuality. They merely limit the practice of the effort to change that. So there's no ban necessarily on helping, a minor individual cope with their sexuality or working through any of the complex issues surrounding sexuality, but it does ban the use of an attempt to change that sexuality. So I believe it's a good distinction to highlight there, that minors are still, allowed to explore these, mental thoughts and practices surrounding sexuality, which everyone is aware is a very complex thing, even for heteronormative individuals as well as homosexual individuals. A very complex thing when someone is coming of age, and so it is beneficial for them to still speak to a licensed healthcare professional about those matters, but the healthcare professional is banned from any attempt to change that persuasion. As of March 2020, this month, there are 20 states that have similar laws banning conversion therapy for minors. The states and territories banning conversion therapy for minors, I will list them briefly. So they are California, New Jersey, Oregon, Illinois, Vermont, New Mexico, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Nevada, Washington, Hawaii, Delaware, Maryland, New Hampshire, New York, Massachusetts, Colorado, Maine, Utah, Virginia, and the territories of Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico. Now that's a long list, and I'm sure you were, droning as I was listing it off to you, but I want to emphasize that while it is a long list, that's a good long list to have. And that list is very promising as far as future states that are signing these bills into law. I think it is very uplifting to hear that this magnitude of states have seen the negative impacts which we discussed before on minors, with the likelihood of increased chance for suicidal behavior, use of drugs, all of these things, these states have recognized and made a proactive effort. And it is very comforting to hear that these states are taking care of their minor citizens in this way. I want to briefly discuss the case law surrounding it. As we touched on the legislation, I would like to now touch on the jurisprudence. So there's a landmark case, Ferguson v. Jonah, which Jonah is an acronym for Jews Offering a New Alternatives to Homosexuality. So this case, the practice of conversion therapy was considered as consumer fraud due to the promising of results that conversion therapy would be successful, while these results could not rightly be achieved, thus violating the New Jersey Consumer Fraud Act. This case was decided on June 3rd, 2015, and it is the first case that challenged conversion therapy practices. It is also the first ruling, it was a pretrial ruling, from a court to state that homosexuality was not a mental disorder or disease. So that's a New Jersey state case, and now I want to get into the Supreme Court precedent regarding conversion therapy. So this case is NIFLA, the National Institute of Family and Life Advocates, versus Becerra. Now, this case dealt with, I believe, an abortion issue, but in this opinion, Justice Thomas rejects the set forth notion that professional speech should receive less First Amendment protection. So this would have a potential dangerous impact on the progress conversion therapy and the banning of it has made in the United States, because this could impact conversion therapy for minors due to licensed and unlicensed therapists, advisors, and ministers may be able to use this principle of less protection of professional speech not being necessarily accurate as a principle in order to further protect their speech regarding non-intrusive conversion talk therapy. So therefore, Justice Thomas is saying that First Amendment protection should apply fully to professional speech in a way that it hasn't been in the past, and this would free up these professionals who are administering certain conversion therapy tactics towards minors to use those tactics further. And this would be dangerous due to the impacts that it has. This would endanger conversion therapy bans as well. So now that we know kind of the impacts of this, who it affects, how does it impact them, how has it impacted LGBT minors in the past, what is the legislation being done to correct this and to ban this, what is the judicial steps being taken, what is the future outlook concerning conversion therapy and its dangerous impact on minors? Well, there are currently 19 states which have proposed conversion therapy legislation. So I listed the 20 or so states and territories that have current law in effect banning conversion therapy for minors, and there are now 19 more states that have proposed conversion therapy legislation, which, doing the math, I know I'm not the best at math, but that is close to a totality of our 50 states, shy about 8 or 9. So that's very, very uplifting. Also, there are certain resources. A great one that I have found through this research is the Trevor Project. The Trevor Project is the largest campaign in the world which advocates for the banning of conversion therapy. It advocates for bans in the US as well as countries around the world, and they seek to work with mental health and other societal institutions to bridge the gap in dialogue concerning conversion therapy. So it is very also uplifting to know that there are these projects out there and these institutions that exist to help change and inform people not only of the dangerous use of conversion therapy, but also in a way that, a positive change can be made through the legal avenue. So that is what I have for you regarding LGBT youth and conversion therapy, and I look forward to hearing about you guys' presentations. Thank you.